This lecture is going to be about the Iraqi Study Group report that came out in 2006 about Iraq. And I'm including it because I think it's an excellent example of what Aristotle means by practical wisdom, what he means by some people are better suited, they have more capacity to make good decisions about serious questions involving the use of power than others are. And I think the entire process of forming this group, the way they operated, their methodology, and then their conclusions are really good examples of a non-ideological, completely practically wise based approach. I particularly want to bring this up because people who disagreed with this approach, people who are basically on the opposite end of the spectrum, identified themselves with a love of the classics and classical education. Vice President Cheney disagreed with this approach and didn't like it when they presented their report. And his wife had been the head of the National Endowment for the Humanities and was very critical of more current trends in education that are more inclusive, that you have books about women, minorities, underrepresented groups, and she was very insistent on the importance of a classical education. So I think that once again Aristotle has gotten co-opted by those with power and privilege to justify their power and privilege. And so I want to argue that it's really the opposite. The people who took the opposite approach to Mr. Cheney are the ones who are really following Aristotle's model of practical wisdom. So I'll start out by explaining, reading about this group and their methodology and their credentials, and then first of all, it was 10 people, 5 of them Democrats, 5 of them Republicans. They were led, the first Republican chosen was James Baker, who was a former U.S. Secretary of State and a former Democratic congressman. Former Secretary of State. And then the Democrat was Lee Hamilton, and they were chosen because, quote, they had the breadth of knowledge of foreign affairs required to co-chair this bipartisan effort. The co-chairs subsequently selected the other members of the bipartisan Iraqi study group, all senior individuals with distinguished records of public service. And it has all of their credentials listed on the back. And they all have extensive credentials. They all have reputations for considering all points of view and basically being cooperative and moderate and being able to get along with people on the other side of the political spectrum. Then their methodology was to have plenary sessions, and they had 9 plenary sessions. One of them was in Baghdad, where they consulted with a number of different officials, leaders. The one in Iraq, they have a list of all the people they consulted: the president, the vice president, prime minister, minister of interior, defense, foreign affairs, and there's about 50 of them. Then there was the current U.S. administration officials that they met with, senior administration officials, Department of Defense and military officials, Department of the State, civilian embassy personnel, the intelligence community, other senior officials, members of Congress, the U.S. Senate, the U.S. House, foreign officials, officials from countries in the area other than Iraq, former officials and experts. So there are hundreds of people that they consulted during these sessions. They had expert working groups and advisory panels, one on economy and reconstruction, one on military and security, one on political developments, one on strategic environment, one on military senior advisor panel. So it was a meeting of the minds, hundreds of minds. And my claim is that this is the systems approach as described both by Ernst Laszlo and by the Greeks. Greek tragedy, Greek mythology, Homer, and Plato, and Aristotle's theory all emphasize this importance of listening to the other guy, fairness to opposing points of view, intellectual honesty, commitment to truth, tolerance with complexity and ambiguity, patience with complexity and ambiguity, tolerance of reasoned dissent. They all are exercising those qualities of character which constitute practical wisdom. These are not easy. This is difficult. It's a moral virtue. It requires strength of character. It requires the character trait of justice, the desire to rule for the sake of the ruled, the desire to use your power in a way that will promote flourishing in the area, as well as the intelligence and the experience to do so. And that's what they say at the beginning. These people have the experience necessary. So they were chosen as people of practical wisdom in Aristotle's sense. Then they made 79 recommendations at the end of it, and they all voted unanimously. There were many other recommendations submitted, but if it wasn't unanimous, if all 10 of them didn't accept it, it was thrown out. So they came up with 79 unanimous recommendations. 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans, senior officials, people that were highly respected, came to agreement about this. I'm not going to get into what's happened since then, because my point is that this is an excellent model for how we should conduct public affairs in relation to all practical issues, not just this issue. And in relationship to, obviously now we have a Syria problem, we have an ISIS problem, and I'm not going to talk about the history of what's happened since then, which of these recommendations were wise or unwise. Probably it was just, there's so many variables. But my main point is that this is the only way you can come up with any kind of reasonable behavior, is to conduct these kinds of study groups, and I would say to have them going all the time, and calling in people, having experts whose job is to continually assess a situation, and having it be a bipartisan committee so that it doesn't become polarized, so that you don't have all sorts of so-called experts who are basically hired by think tanks whose funding is supplied by somebody with a one-sided agenda. So you have experts whose salary depends upon them taking one side. We don't want to hear from those experts. There was an article by Nicholas Kristof saying that the experts in general don't get anything any more right than the average person, or chance. So when your experts are biased due to ulterior motives, this is not the way to run a society. So these people had no ulterior motives. They weren't going to get elected or failed to get elected based on what they said. They were from both parties. And that's why I think it's a kind of model that we have to keep in mind and have to ask our political leaders to set up these kinds of study groups on every issue: healthcare, education. We don't want one-sided approaches. We want people to talk to each other. We want some evidence-based claims, and we also want different perspectives. That sometimes the evidence, the studies, are biased, and the importance of this or that. I mean, there's so many biases built into simple studies. So you have to have different perspectives combined with some research and evidence. Okay, so I'm going to try and I'm going to read these recommendations, and with one's imagination about what's the difference between 2006 and 2014, which is huge, but then we can anticipate what's the difference between this and 8 years from now. But the only way to move forward, the only way to provide any hope that we can create something decent, some kind of flourishing in that area, is if we proceed with this kind of method. We have to make up our minds, then we have to re-examine, change our minds, adjust, but we constantly need feed in from the boots on the ground, the specialists in each country, people from different perspectives, the way the Iraqi study group set it up. So here's their summary. The new diplomatic offensive. They start out with diplomacy. That's number one. Recommendation 1. The United States, working with the Iraqi government, should launch the comprehensive new diplomatic offensive to deal with the problems of Iraq and of the region. The new diplomatic offensive should be launched before December 31st, 2006. Recommendation 2. The goals of the diplomatic offensive as it relates to regional players should be to, first, support the unity and territorial integrity of Iraq. 2. Stop destabilizing interventions and actions by Iraq's neighbors. 3. Secure Iraq's borders, including the use of joint patrols with neighboring countries. 4. Prevent the expansion of the instability and conflict beyond Iraq's borders. 5. Promote economic assistance, commerce, trade, political support, and if possible, military assistance for the Iraq government from non-neighboring Muslim nations. 6. Energize countries to support national political reconciliation in Iraq. 7. Validate Iraq's legitimacy by resuming diplomatic relations where appropriate and re-establishing embassies in Baghdad. 8. Assist Iraq in establishing active working embassies in key capitals in the region, such as in Saudi Arabia. 9. Help Iraq reach a mutually acceptable agreement on Kirkuk. 10. Assist the Iraqi government in achieving certain security, political, and economic milestones, including better performance on issues such as national reconciliation, equitable distribution of oil revenues, and the dismantling of militias. Recommendation 3. As a complement to the diplomatic offensive, and in addition to the support group discussed below, the United States and the Iraqi government should support the holding of a conference or meeting in Baghdad of the Organization of the Islamic Conference or the Arab League, both to assist the Iraqi government in promoting national reconciliation in Iraq and to reestablish their diplomatic presence in Iraq. So the international support group has to include Turkey, Iran, Syria, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, other Arab Gulf countries, and then they talk about each country and what each country's responsibility can be. Recommendation 4. As an instrument of the new diplomatic offensive, an Iraq International Support Group should be organized immediately following the launch of the new diplomatic offensive. Number 5. The support group should consist of Iraq and all the states bordering Iraq, including Iran and Syria, the key regional states, including Egypt and the Gulf states, the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, the European Union, and of course Iraq itself, Other countries, for example Germany, Japan, and South Korea, that might be willing to contribute to resolving political, diplomatic, and security problems affecting Iraq, could also become members. Number 6. The new diplomatic offensive and the work of the support group should be carried out with urgency and should be conducted by and organized at the level of foreign minister or above. The Secretary of State, if not the President, should lead the U.S. effort. That effort should be both bilateral and multilateral as circumstances require. Number 7. The support group should call on the participation of the Office of the United Nations Secretary General in its work. The United Nations Secretary General should designate a special envoy as his representative. Number 8. The support group, as part of the new diplomatic offensive, should develop specific approaches to neighboring countries that take into account the interests, perspectives, and potential contributions as suggested above, right? That's consulting all points of view, tolerating dissent, being patient with complexity and ambiguity, being intellectually honest, and being committed to truth and to getting something done rather than reducing it to money and power. Recommendation 9. Under the new diplomatic offensive and support group, the United States should engage directly with Iran and Syria in order to try to obtain their commitment to constructive policies toward Iraq and other regional issues. In engaging Syria and Iran, the U.S. should consider incentives as well as disincentives in seeking constructive results. Number 10. The issue of Iran's nuclear program should continue to be dealt with by the United Nations Security Council and its 5 permanent members, the U.S., UK, France, Russia, and China, plus Germany. Number 11. Diplomatic efforts within the support group should seek to persuade Iran that it should take specific steps to improve the situation in Iraq. Number 12. The U.S. and the support group should encourage and persuade Syria of the merit of such contributions as the following. Syria could control its border with Iraq to the maximum extent possible and work together with Iraqis on joint patrols in the border. Doing so will help stem the flow of funding insurgents and terrorists in and out of Iraq. Syria can establish hotlines to exchange information with the Iraqis. Syria can increase its political and economic cooperation with Iraq. Number 13. There must be a renewed and sustained commitment by the U.S. to a comprehensive Arab-Israeli peace on all fronts. Lebanon and Syria and President Bush's June 2002 commitment to a two-state solution for Israel and Palestine. Number 14. This effort should include, as soon as possible, the unconditional calling and holding of meetings under the auspices of the U.S. or the Quartet, the U.S., Russia, European Union, and the UN, between Israel and Lebanon and Syria on the one hand, and Israel and Palestinians who acknowledge Israel's right to exist on the other. The purpose of these meetings would be to negotiate peace as was done at the Madrid Conference in 1991 and on 2 separate tracks, one Syrian-Lebanese and the other Palestinian. Number 15. Concerning Syria, some elements of that negotiated peace should be Syria's full adherence to the UN Security Council resolution of 2006, which provides the framework for Lebanon to regain sovereign control over its territory. Syria's full cooperation with all investigations into political assassinations in Lebanon. A verifiable cessation of Syrian aid to Hezbollah and the use of Syrian territory for transshipment of Iranian weapons to aid Hezbollah. Syria's use of its influence with Hamas and Hezbollah for the release of the captured Israeli Defense Force soldiers. A verifiable cessation of Syrian efforts to undermine the democratically elected government of Lebanon. A verifiable cessation of arms shipments from or transmitting through Syria for Hamas and other radical Palestinian groups. A Syrian commitment to help obtain from Hamas an acknowledgement of Israel's right to exist. greater Syrian efforts to seal its border with Iraq. Of course, the Syria situation has totally changed, but that's why you need to have these kind of joint efforts. Get the professionals, get the experts to talk to each other, so you can come up with some kind of bipartisan, multi-dimensional approach to the problem and set of recommendations. Recommendation 16. In exchange for these actions, and in the context of a full and secure peace agreement, the Israelis should return the Golan Heights, with a U.S. security guarantee for Israel that could include an international force on the border, including U.S. troops if requested by both parties. Number 17, concerning the Palestinian issue, elements of that negotiated peace should include adherence to U.S. Security Council resolutions and to the principle of land for peace, which are the only basis for achieving peace, strong support for Palestinian President and the Palestinian Authority to take the lead in preparing the way for negotiations with Israel, a major effort to move from the current hostilities by consolidating the ceasefire reached between the Palestinians and the Israelis in November of 2006, support for a Palestinian national unity government, and sustainable negotiations leading to a final peace settlement along the lines of President Bush's two-state solution, which would address the key final status issues of borders, settlements, Jerusalem, the right of return, and the end of conflict. Recommendation 18. It's critical for the U.S. to provide additional political, economic, and military support for Afghanistan, including resources that might become available as combat forces are moved from Iraq. Okay, that's the external approach, the relationship of other countries. Then there's the internal approach, helping Iraqis help themselves. Number 19, the President and the leadership of his national security team should remain in close and frequent contact with the Iraqi leadership. These contacts must convey a clear message. There must be action by the Iraqi government to make substantial progress toward the achievement of milestones. In public diplomacy, the President should convey as much detail as possible about the substance of these exchanges in order to keep the American people, the Iraqi people, and the countries in the region well informed. Number 20, if the Iraqi government demonstrates political will and makes substantial progress toward the achievement of milestones on national reconciliation, security, and governance, the United States should make clear its willingness to continue training, assistance, and support for Iraqi security forces, and to continue political, military, and economic support for the Iraqi government. As Iraq becomes more capable of governing, defending, and sustaining itself, the U.S. military and civilian presence in Iraq can be reduced. Number 21. If the Iraqi government does not make substantial progress toward the achievement of milestones on national reconciliation, security, and governance, the United States should reduce its political, military, or economic support for the Iraqi government. Number 22. The President should state that the U.S. does not seek permanent military bases in Iraq. If the Iraq government were to request a temporary base or bases, then the U.S. government could consider that request, as it would in the case of any other government. Number 23, the President should restate that the United States does not seek to control Iraq's oil. Okay, and then they have milestones. By a certain date, what should have gone on in terms of reconciliation, in terms of security, in terms of governance. Okay, number 24, the contemplated completion dates of the end of 2006 or early 2007 for some milestones may not be realistic. They should be completed by the first quarter of 2007. Number 25, these milestones are a good start. The U.S. should consult closely with the Iraq government and develop additional milestones in 3 areas. As with the current milestones, these additional ones should be tied to calendar dates to the fullest extent possible. Next, national reconciliation. Constitution review, number 26. Review of the Constitution is essential to national reconciliation and should be pursued on an urgent basis. The United Nations has expertise in this field and should play a role in this process. Number 27. De-Baathification. Political reconciliation requires the reintegration of Ba'athists and Arab nationalists into national life, with the leading figures of Saddam Hussein's regime excluded. The U.S. should encourage the return of qualified Iraqi professionals, Sunni or Shia, nationalist or ex-Ba'athist, Kurd or Turkmen or Christian or Arab, into the government. Number 28. Oil revenue sharing. Oil revenues should accrue to the central government and be shared on the basis of population. No formula that gives control over revenues from future fields to the regions or gives control of oil fields to the regions is compatible with national reconciliation. Number 29. Provincial elections. Provincial elections should be held at the earliest possible date. Under the Constitution, new provincial elections should have been held already. They are necessary to restore representative government. Number 30. Kirkuk. Given the very dangerous situation there, international arbitration is necessary to avert communal violence. The area's mix of Kurdish, Arab, and Turkmen populations could make it a powder keg. A referendum on the future of Kirkuk, as required by the Iraqi constitution before the end of 2007, would be explosive and should be delayed. This issue should be placed on the agenda of the International Iraq Support Group as part of the new diplomatic offensive. Number 31. Amnesty. Amnesty proposals must be far-reaching. Any successful effort at national reconciliation must involve those in the government finding ways and means to reconcile with former bitter enemies. 32. Minorities. The rights of women and the rights of all minority communities in Iraq, including Turks, Assyrians, Armenians, and others, must be protected. Number 33. Civil society. The Iraq government should stop using the process of registering non-governmental organizations as a tool for politicizing or stopping their activities. Registration should be solely an administrative act, not an occasion for government censorship and interference. Number 34. The question of the future U.S. force presence must be on the table for discussion as the national reconciliation dialogue takes place. Its inclusion will increase the likelihood of participation by insurgents and militia leaders and thereby increase the possibilities of success. Number 35. The U.S. must make active efforts to engage all parties in Iraq, with the exception of Al-Qaeda. The U.S. must find a way to talk to these various, they have specific names. Number 36. The U.S. should encourage dialogue between sectarian communities, as outlined in the new diplomatic offensive. It should press religious leaders inside and outside Iraq to speak out on behalf of peace and reconciliation. 37. Iraq amnesty proposals must not be undercut in Washington by either the executive or the legislative branch. Number 38. The U.S. should support the presence of neutral international experts as advisors to the Iraq government on the processes of disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration. Number 39. The U.S. should provide financial and technical support and establish a single office in Iraq to coordinate assistance to the Iraqi government and its expert advisors to aid a program to disarm, demobilize, and reintegrate militia members. Okay, the next section is security and military forces. So they started out with diplomacy. That's number 1. Now they deal with security and military. Number 40. The U.S. should not make an open-ended commitment to keep large numbers of American troops deployed in Iraq. 41. The U.S. must make it clear to the Iraq government that the U.S. could carry out its plans, including planned redeployment, even if Iraq does not implement its planned changes. America's other security needs and the future of our military cannot be made hostage to the actions or inactions of the Iraq government. Number 42, we should seek to complete the training and equipping mission by the first quarter of 2008. 43, military priorities in Iraq must change, with the highest priority given to the training, equipping, advising, and support mission and to counterterrorism operations. 44, the most highly qualified U.S. officers and military personnel should be assigned to the embedded teams. An American team should be present with Iraq units down to the company level. The U.S. military should establish suitable career-enhancing incentives for these officers and personnel. 45. The U.S. should support more and better equipment for the Iraq Army by encouraging the Iraq government to accelerate its foreign military sales requests and, as American combat brigades move out of Iraq, by leaving behind some American equipment for Iraqi forces. 46. The new Secretary of Defense should make every effort to build healthy civil-military relations by creating an environment in which the senior military feel free to offer independent advice not only to the civilian leadership in the Pentagon, but also to the President and the National Security Council. On 47, as redeployment proceeds, the Pentagon leadership should emphasize training and education programs for the forces that have returned to the continental U.S. in order to reset the force and restore the U.S. military to a high level of readiness for global contingencies. 48. As equipment returns to the U.S., Congress should appropriate sufficient funds to restore the equipment to full functionality over the next 5 years. 49. The administration, in full consultation with the relevant committees of Congress, should assess the full future budgetary impact of the war in Iraq and its potential impact on the future readiness of the force, the ability to recruit and retain high-quality personnel, needed investments in procurement and in research and development, and the budgets of other U.S. government agencies involved in the stability and reconstruction effort. The next section is police and criminal justice. Number 50. The entire Iraq National Police should be transferred to the Ministry of Defense, where the police commando units will become part of the new Iraqi army. Number 51. The entire Iraq Border Police should be transferred to the Military of Defense, which would have total responsibility for border control and external security. 52. The Iraq Police Service should be given greater responsibility to conduct criminal investigations and should expand its cooperation with other elements in the Iraq judicial system in order to better control crime and protect Iraqi citizens. 53. The Iraq Ministry of the Interior should undergo a process of organizational transformation, including efforts to expand the capability and reach of the current Major Crime Unit, or Criminal Investigation Division, and to exert more authority over local police forces. The sole authority to pay police salaries and disburse financial support to local police should be transferred to the Ministry of the Interior. 54. The Iraq Ministry of the Interior should proceed with current efforts to identify, register, and control the Facilities Protection Service. This is related to the fact that it's hard to give weapons to people in the name of having a job in the police force when those people were former bitter enemies, because they might use those weapons against each other. So I think what you're getting at is to have it less locally centralized, locally organized, and have a more central organizational unit, and then they would be accountable, so that you have to find a way to have accountability and make sure people aren't killing each other in the name because they are members of the police force and they have weapons. Okay, recommendation 55. The U.S. Department of Defense should continue its mission to train the Iraq National Police and the Iraq Border Police which should be placed within the Iraq Ministry of Defense. 56. The U.S. Department of Justice should direct the training mission of the police forces remaining under the Ministry of the Interior. 57. Just as U.S. military training teams are embedded within Iraq Army units, the current practice of embedding U.S. police trainers should be expanded and the numbers of civilian training officers increased so that teams can cover all levels of the Iraq police service, including local police stations. These trainers should be obtained from among experienced civilian police executives and supervisors from around the world. These officers would replace the military police personnel currently assigned to training teams. 58. The FBI should expand its investigative and forensic training and facilities within Iraq to include coverage of terrorism as well as criminal activity. 59. The Iraq government should provide funds to expand and upgrade communications equipment and motor vehicles for the Iraq Police Service. Number 60. The U.S. Department of Justice should lead the work of organizational transformation in the Ministry of the Interior. This approach must involve Iraq officials, starting at senior levels and moving down, to create a strategic plan and work out standard administrative procedures, codes of conduct, and operational measures that Iraqis will accept and use. These plans must be drawn up in partnership. 61. Programs led by the U.S. Department of Justice to establish courts, to train judges, prosecutors, and investigators, and to create institutions and practices to fight corruption must be strongly supported and funded. New and refurbished courthouses with improved physical security, secure housing for judges and judicial staff, witness protection facilities, and a new Iraqi Marshals Service are essential parts of a secure and functioning system of justice. The next section is about the oil sector. Number 62. As soon as possible, the U.S. government should provide technical assistance to the Iraqi government to prepare a draft oil law that defines the rights of regional and local governments and creates a fiscal and legal framework for investment. Legal clarity is essential to attract investment. The U.S. government should encourage the Iraqi government to accelerate contracting for the comprehensive well workovers in the southern fields needed to increase production, but the U.S. should no longer fund such infrastructure projects. The U.S. military should work with the Iraq military and with private security forces to protect oil infrastructures and contractors. Protective measures could include a program to improve pipeline security by paying local tribes solely on the basis of throughput rather than fixed amounts. Metering should be implemented at both ends of the supply line. This step would immediately improve accountability in the oil sector. In conjunction with the International Monetary Fund, the U.S. government should press Iraq to continue reducing subsidies in the energy sector, instead of providing grant assistance. Until Iraq's pay market prices for oil products, drastic fuel shortages will remain. Number 63. The U.S. should encourage investment in Iraq's oil sector by the international community and by international energy companies. Next, the U.S. should assist Iraqi leaders to reorganize the national oil industry as a commercial enterprise in order to enhance efficiency, transparency, and accountability. Next, to combat corruption, the U.S. government should urge the Iraqi government to post all oil contracts, volumes, and prices on the web so that Iraqis and outside observers can track exports and export revenues. Next, so that it's government, the oil industry is now run by the government and it's not transparent. So the group decided making it a commercial enterprise would make it better, more accountable. Alright. The U.S. should support the World Bank's efforts to ensure that best practices are used in contracting. This support involves providing Iraqi officials with contracting templates and training them in contracting, auditing, and reviewing audits. The U.S. should provide technical assistance to the Ministry of Oil for enhancing maintenance, improving the payments process, managing cash flows, contracting and auditing, and updating professional training programs for management and technical personnel. Okay, number 64. U.S. economic assistance should be increased to a level of $5 billion per year rather than being permitted to decline. The President needs to ask for the necessary resources and must work hard to win the support of Congress. Capacity building and job creation, including reliance on the Commander's Emergency Response Program, should be U.S. priorities. Economic assistance should be provided on a non-sectarian basis. Number 65. An essential part of reconstruction efforts in Iraq should be greater involvement by and with international partners, who should do more than just contribute money. They should also actively participate in the design and construction of projects. 66. The U.S. should take the lead in funding assistance requests from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and other humanitarian agencies. Yeah, there were how many million refugees? There were internal refugees, and then there were refugees who left Iraq and went to nearby countries. That was a huge mess, or it still is. 67. The President should create a senior advisor for economic reconstruction in Iraq. 68. The Chief of Mission in Iraq should have the authority to spend significant funds through a program structured around the lines of the Commander's Emergency Response Program, and should have the authority to rescind funding from programs and projects in which the government of Iraq is not demonstrating effective partnership. 69. The authority of the Special Inspector General for Iraq Reconstruction should be renewed for the duration of assistance programs in Iraq. 70. A more flexible security assistance program for Iraq, breaking down the barriers to effective interagency cooperation, should be authorized and implemented. 71. Authority to merge U.S. funds with those from international donors and Iraq participants on behalf of assistance projects should be provided. 72. Costs for the war in Iraq should be included in the President's annual budget request starting in 2008. The war is in its fourth year, and the normal budget process should not be circumvented. Funding requests for the war in Iraq should be presented clearly to Congress and the American people. Congress must carry out its constitutional responsibility to review budget requests for the war in Iraq carefully and to conduct oversight. 73. The Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense, and the Director of National Intelligence should accord the highest possible priority to professional language proficiency and cultural training in general and specifically for U.S. officers and personnel about to be assigned to Iraq. 74. In the short term, if not enough civilians volunteer to fill key positions in Iraq, civilian agencies must fill those positions with directed assignments. Steps should be taken to mitigate familiar or financial hardships posed by directed assignments, including tax exclusions similar to those authorized for U.S. military personnel serving in Iraq. That's where civilians, career diplomats who are serving elsewhere don't want to go to Iraq. So, question is how to make them go there. 75. For the longer term, the U.S. government needs to improve how its constituent agencies, Defense, State, Agency for International Development, Treasury, Justice, the intelligence community, and others respond to a complex stability operation like that represented by this decade's Iraq and Afghanistan wars and the previous decade's operations in the Balkans. They need to train for and conduct joint operations across agency boundaries. Okay, so again, now we're in Syria, and we need to have this coordination between all our different agencies. 76. The State Department should train personnel to carry out civilian tasks associated with a complex stability operation outside of the traditional embassy setting. It should establish a Foreign Service Reserve Corps with personnel and expertise to provide surge capacity for such an operation. Other key civilian agencies, including Treasury, Justice, and Agriculture, need to create similar technical assistance capabilities. Number 77. The Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense should devote significantly greater analytic resources to the task of understanding the threats and sources of violence in Iraq. 78. The Director of National Intelligence and the Secretary of Defense should also institute immediate changes in the collection of data about violence and the sources of violence in Iraq to provide a more accurate picture of events on the ground. Number 79. The CIA should provide additional personnel in Iraq to develop and train an effective intelligence service and to build a counterterrorism intelligence center that will facilitate intelligence-led counterterrorism efforts. Okay, so why did I read all of that? Well, first of all, I want to get, people have to be reminded of how complicated all of this is and not oversimplify. The quality of debate among the ordinary person gets so oversimplified, it's just mind-boggling. And once you read that, and then you realize, okay, now we're with the ISIS and the ISIL and Syria and all of this, it's even more complicated. So what can we learn from those recommendations? I don't know enough about the history since then to be specific, and I wouldn't be able to talk about it here anyway. But one thing for sure is that you have to train people who go to school. The schools have to train people for the situation. People have to get over being partisan. It's got to be a bipartisan effort. It's got to be based on practical wisdom. You can't allow politicians to get votes to engage in oversimplified rhetoric in order to get votes, and then to have to follow through on what they promised in that rhetoric in order to get votes. The public needs to know it's complicated. The public needs to demand moderation, compromise, bipartisanship, a holistic approach, a systematic approach. The public has to stop wanting quick fixes. The public wanted to take revenge after 9/11. 71% of the American public wanted us to go to war after that. Stupid, impulsive, thoughtless. So the public just needs to understand this is how complicated these situations are, and recognize that going to war does not solve problems. It creates more problems than it solves. And the Iliad is a very good example. The Iliad is a great anti-war war story. It tells you everything that can go wrong, and it just gives it to you as a story. I mean, you can tell by reading the Iraqi Study Group report that if you try to get a picture of what's going on in the ground, you're going to get something as bad or worse than the Iliad. Worse, okay, but the Greek Homer, the Greek literary texts understand the human mind, that most people think in terms of stories. They need something embedded, something incarnated, and from there they can reflect and understand the patterns underneath. So you start out with the story and end up with something like the Iraqi Study Group report. So you have a story of what's going on in the ground. You have, here's the patterns, here's the different areas: intelligence, diplomacy, economics, national security, personal security, procurements. Oh my gosh, it's so complicated. But that's the way it is. And so you just face the complications and figure out how to make recommendations, always with the goal of achievable goals, bipartisan interests. Everybody is interested in trying to promote stability in the Mideast, except who are the people who are not? People who make money from the oil business. So our vice president during that period, worked for a company that he promoted the interests of while he was in office, that their stock prices before we went into Iraq were $8, $8 and something. After we went into Iraq, when we started the reconstruction effort, which was $80 billion, $60 billion just to protect Americans. We gave our contracts to American companies, not to Iraqi companies. We built villages for Filipinos to come in and take the jobs rather than Iraqis. The stock prices of the vice president's favored company went from $8 to 60 some dollars. This does not go over well with people in Iraq. They do not think that we're motivated by a desire for justice. They think we're motivated by the desire for cheap oil. And that does not mean that everybody in that political party is that way at all. As a matter of fact, the 5 people on their Iraqi study group report are very much against it, which is why we can change. Our system can change, not our structure of our system, but who we elect, who is actually running the country, who is actually leading in either of the political parties. It can change very fast. But the American people need to have a more accurate picture of what's going on. And also, there is such a thing as practical wisdom. And there is such a thing as manipulation by using the language of practical wisdom. So, to some extent, people at the top are smarter. They can use that intelligence to promote well-being or to undermine well-being. Very hard for the public to know, because it's very hard for the public to understand what's attainable. But I think the worst thing that goes on is the deliberate miseducation of the public, either by oversimplifying a problem, by ignoring it, denying it, by focusing on ideological positions that really have very little to do with a politician. For example, anti-gay rhetoric. That was the 2004 election. Part of the strategy was to put marriage amendments on the ballots of 11 states that were border states, so that people who otherwise wouldn't vote would vote, and they would vote for the party you wanted. Well, again, Mr. Cheney has a gay daughter. He's very close to her, and it was entirely a strategy to get votes. It wasn't something Mr. Cheney even believed in, was denying his own daughter rights because she's gay. But so that miseducation of the public, the distraction of the public, is a real abuse of power, and it's all done in the name of practical wisdom. So, and then the public needs to learn to be savvy about this and not let itself get manipulated. And again, we're going to study Homer, Greek mythology, tragedy, and Plato, because that's what they're trying to do. They're trying to convince people on the top, don't act unjustly, it's self-destructive in the end, and they're trying to educate the people not on the top, the rest of us, to be savvy and to be critical thinkers and to have at least some vague picture in our minds of how complicated the situation is. Colin Powell had his principles. Colin Powell completely disagreed with us going in, and he had a lot of good issues from the beginning. He said, before you decide to go into Iraq, you should ask these questions. Is a vital national security interest threatened? Do we have a clear, attainable objective? Have the risks and costs been fully and frankly analyzed? Have all other non-violent policy means been fully exhausted? Is there a plausible exit strategy to avoid endless entanglement? Have the consequences of our actions been fully considered? Is the action supported by the American people? do we have genuine, broad international support? And the only one that could remotely be considered positive is the support of the American people, and that was arrived at through a whole lot of political distortion and manipulation and distraction. So I think Colin Powell was right. I think history will prove that he was right. And I think American people need to become just more educated about political things, and um, political leaders need to be more just. And we have to find a way not to reward people for acting unjustly, but in the name of some sort of either distraction or manipulation, um, fraud, basically. So, in conclusion, I think we ought to use the Iraqi Study Group report as a good model for practical wisdom. The public needs to learn how to deliberate better. The rulers need to rule for the sake of the rules. We need to know that some people are better than others at practical wisdom. How we would know is these are people who can listen to hundreds of testimonies, synthesize information, consider all sides, come up with a compromise, value compromise as part of the process of being successful. Even if you don't end up doing what you would consider best, you have to you can't consider what's best in a vacuum. Aristotle says that. You can analyze the options, but if the best option is basically not an option, you have to take it off the table. You have to do something that's attainable and something that all sides will agree to. So the fact that these 10 people, 5 from each side of the aisle, could agree on all these things shows you that this is a possible process. It's not idealistic. It's completely realistic. When we do anything else, we only make things worse. So Aristotle's view is realistic, and I think the Greeks are quintessentially realistic.